Ready? 3, 2, 1, starting now.
Welcome everyone to another one of the CAES Luncheon Seminars. I am proud to introduce Dr. Megan Linske. She is a postdoctoral scientist here at the Experiment Station working on a tick control project as well as various other tick associated projects. And has she got her PhD up at the University of Connecticut working on ticks and their impact in the environment and relationships to the wildlife. So she's got quite an extensive wildlife background here as well. Entomology and wildlife, good combination here for working on vector-borne diseases. So I'm happy to have her present her work on researching the impacts of a warming climate on survival and range expansion of the pathogen vectors Ixodes scapularis and Amblyomma americanum. Okay, Megan.
Thank you, Kirby. So I'm so excited to be giving this talk today, and thank you all for tuning in. I know this isn't a very conventional way to do these seminars anymore, but they're still just as good. So Kirby gave a great introduction. So my name is Megan Linske. I'm a postdoc here at the Ag Station. And I know it's a long title, but basically what I'm going to be talking about is climate effects, specifically looking at winter weather variables and their effects on we'll be talking about Ixodes scapularis, which is the black-legged tick, and Amblyomma americanum, which is the lone star tick, but I'm also going to talk about a couple other species that I think are of importance right now. So once again, Kirby kind of laid out some of my background, but just so that we're all on the same page, and for those of you who I haven't met or I don't know yet, so I did my undergrad up in Nazareth College in Rochester, and I got my master's in environmental science. With minors in biology, chemistry, English lit. And then right after that, I came to the station and started working in the forestry and horticulture department under Dr. Scott Williams. And from there, which was, oh my goodness, 8 years ago, I started my career here and contemporaneously got my master's and PhD at the University of Connecticut. The focus of my research at that time and my dissertation research was looking at Lyme disease ecology and the role of hosts and habitats and the density and distribution of black-legged ticks and their associated pathogens. And like Kirby said, I have a lot of background in wildlife biology, so it kind of all came together quite nicely and helps me look at the ecological approach to solving some of these tick-borne illnesses and hopefully reducing the spread of them in human populations. So I also can't claim credit for this slide, but I stole it from one of Kirby's previous presentations, but I think it bodes well for this presentation as it focuses on the large issue of ticks. So ticks are a pretty big issue here in Connecticut, as well as throughout much of the Northeast and globally for that matter. I know for me as a young kid, I was outside all day, every day, and very rarely came inside with a tick, and now I can walk to my mailbox and pick up a tick. So it's definitely getting worse over the years, and I feel like we're overwhelmed with them right now. And statistics such as this kind of further bolster that theory. If you look at this, this is tick-borne disease cases reported in the US between 2004 and 2016 from the CDC. And you can see there's a steady incline, a couple drops here and there, but overall there's a pretty steep incline over the years to almost about 60,000 cases of tick-borne related illnesses. And then just to kind of highlight a subsection of that, about 40,000 of those cases are Lyme disease. And then to kind of bring that even more into the story, they say that this is just reported cases, that actually it's tenfold greater. So the 40,000 cases of Lyme disease that we saw in 2017 is probably closer to 400,000 cases of Lyme disease. So that's a lot. That's a lot of Lyme. That's a lot of tick-borne diseases as a whole. And it kind of highlights the relevance of tick-borne diseases, but specifically those that are transmitted by the black-legged tick. And so not only are we seeing this increased number of cases coming up in the landscape, but an increased distribution or expansion of the range of these ticks and their associated pathogens. So if we look at this earlier year here, looking at wedged between Washington and Boston, This kind of is the focal point of a lot of the disease, specifically looking at Lyme disease and black-legged ticks and that sort of thing. We see a little bit over here, but not too much. But it only gets darker and wider as the years go on. So in that 15-year gap, we see a pretty large range expansion of the tick that's carrying these pathogens that manifest as Lyme disease and other diseases as well. And they go out and up. So this is important to know. And so it's not just black-legged ticks and Lyme disease that we're focusing on, because we actually have 16 different species of ticks in Connecticut right now. But 3 of them are the most noteworthy because they're the ones that often attach and bite humans and therefore can pass pathogens to them. These 3 species are the black-legged tick, the American dog tick, and the Lone Star tick. And then 4 of them can actually transmit pathogens, and there's even more that can still attach and bite, but might not give you much. And so either way, you're going to end up with the heebie-jeebies by the end of this talk, because they're all kind of creepy-crawly, but some of them are worse than others. So in 2019, we got a grant to start doing an active tick surveillance program in the state of Connecticut. And I think this is definitely worth noting because it kind of gives us an idea of where we stand as a state. So a lot of what we've been seeing is people are telling us there's greater numbers, there's greater diversity, there's greater distribution of these species, but this kind of quantifies it. And so 2019 was our first full year of sampling. And as you can see from these numbers, we got quite a lot of ticks. We got over 2,000 black-legged ticks, almost 500 American dog ticks, 3 Lone Star ticks, and 2 Asian longhorn ticks, which were all tested at the station for pathogens. And so what this kind of tells us is that not only do we're seeing that increased density of black-legged ticks, our most notorious species, and therefore all the associated pathogens that come with it, but we're seeing quite the diversity of species in Connecticut as well. And so that kind of segues into the question of why are they here? Why are we seeing these ticks and tick-borne diseases emerging on our landscape? Well, there's a lot of new stuff on the landscape, but we have a lot of historic factors that contributed to the emergence of ticks and tick-borne diseases in our state, and as well as the Northeast as a whole. So things like reforestation. So historically, we have been an agricultural community here in Connecticut. We have a lot of pasture land for livestock, for crops, that sort of thing. So we largely cut down all of our wooded forests to make these pasture lands and these croplands, and then they became reforested over time. So these woodlands that we have are actually previously disturbed, and therefore there's all different vegetation patterns and compositions that grow that are really hospitable for ticks. It's great habitat for ticks. So that's one of the factors. The other factor is having overabundant and accessible host species. So a lot of the ticks that we'll be talking about today primarily use white-tailed deer as a large-bodied host to get their final blood meals on. And so I don't know if you've noticed or not, but we have a lot of deer on the landscape. We're definitely overabundant in Connecticut and once again throughout much of the Northeast. So this is a huge contributing factor towards the further propagation of ticks like black-legged tick and Lone Star tick and so on and so forth. And then additionally, with all the regrowth of that woodlands, we ended up with a lot of residential areas looking like this. So a lot of the houses that we see are built right into the woodland landscape, which I personally love, and I know a lot of people who live in Connecticut love it as well, but it also increases the interface between us and our daily activities with woodlands where a lot of the host species as well as the tick species are present. So all this kind of makes this intersection where we're in a high-risk area with increased opportunities to encounter ticks across the landscape. And then put this all together, that only increases the number of ticks overall and increases the exposure opportunities for people. So we're kind of at the crux here where we have a lot of opportunities to increase their populations and to encounter them, and it's become quite the nuisance, and this is why we have these emerging ticks and tick-borne diseases. But then additionally, outside of these kind of Northeast specific factors that lend to hosts and habitat, we also have to look at drivers for changes in not only density, but distribution as well. So as we saw earlier with the example of black-legged ticks and Lyme disease, it's not only growing in numbers in these couple locations, but it's increasing density overall, and then they're all expanding their range and into other states, regions, because we all know ticks don't know county or state borders or even country borders. They're going to go wherever there is suitable habitat and hosts. So when we're looking at these drivers for change, we can kind of break them down into three main categories, which I have listed here. So we have host, habitat, and climate as the main drivers. So host and habitat tends to be a lot of the work that we do here at the station. So these are the ones that we can kind of manipulate and modify and use for our management strategies. So when we talk about hosts, primarily with a lot of the tick species we look at here and black-legged ticks, we look at small mammals like white-footed mice, chipmunks, squirrels, and we'll also look at larger bodied hosts like white-tailed deer. And from that vantage point is when we look at ways to manage those particular species so that we can reduce tick populations through those mediums. Then when we look at habitat, we can look at different ways that we want to manage habitat, modify habitat, manipulate habitat to maybe make either less hospitable habitat for them or use things like acaricides, repellents, sprays to ensure that they don't come onto our backyards or invade certain areas or treating areas that are known hotspots. But then this final one, which is going to be the focus of my talk today, is looking at climate. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do on an individual or even a neighborhood or community basis to really impact climate change and climate effects on tick density and distribution. So this is a factor that the best we can do right now is really just learn all that we can about the relationship between climate and these vectors and their associated pathogens. And so when we look at climate, the things that impact ticks specifically, and this is pretty much all ticks, is temperature, rainfall or humidity, and things like snow cover. So most ticks are pretty sensitive to fluctuations in temperature and humidity specifically. They're susceptible to something we call desiccation-induced mortality, which basically means if it's really hot, really cold, or really dry, they turn into like a little tick potato chip. They just dry out and they'll die. So they need this optimal temperature and humidity to not only come out and survive, but then also have enough time to quest for host species in order to obtain a blood meal and further propagate their species. So this is definitely a really, really important relationship to fully understand and then help make some of the management implications that we make for treating some of these areas. So that's where some of our research came in here at the station. So I want to highlight two of the studies that we specifically did in the past couple of years, looking at overwintering of black-legged ticks and lone star ticks. And so what we wanted to do is, like I said, we kind of wanted to quantify that relationship between overwintering survival, climate effects, and the survival of these two keystone species. And so black-legged ticks, the reason for selecting them is pretty obvious. They're the most common species that we have here. They also carry a whole suite of different pathogens that manifest in different tick-borne illnesses and diseases, but Lyme disease is definitely one of the most notorious out there, and everybody wants to solve it. So this is that was the reason we picked the black-legged tick. But then we also wanted to look at the lone star tick. So the lone star tick is of importance because it's recently established in pretty heavily dense populations in areas throughout Connecticut as well as some of our neighboring states. And I'm going to get into the details of the lone star tick specifically in a couple of slides, but they're just a very important species to know about right now because they're only growing in numbers and once again, increasing in density and distribution. So looking at these two species, we wanted to establish what that relationship was, how it might influence pathogen presence and subsequent tick-borne illnesses, and then what factors were specifically contributing to it. Like, could we find these significant predictors within winter weather conditions that influence their numbers every year? And so I won't go into too much detail with this slide because I feel like any talk you've ever gone to about ticks brings up these images. But what you want to know from here is for each tick species, there's a certain life stage that goes through a winter season. So for the black-legged tick, that's primarily the nymphal stage, which is an early life stage. And then for the lone star tick, this is typically the adult males and females that will go through this stage. So what happens is they'll obtain their blood meal and then they'll have to make it through the winter, survive through the winter in order to make it to the the questing activity season of late spring, early summer. So if there's a really cold winter and they don't survive, that's less ticks we're going to see on the landscape, right? So that was the idea behind this study. So like I said, the Lone Star tick was selected as part of this study outside of the black-legged tick because of its significance as it's invading our landscape here in Connecticut. But in its natural range, which is the southeastern United States, it's proving its epidemiological importance. So they're responsible for about 95% of tick bites in the southeastern United States, which is quite a lot. It's comparable to what we're seeing up here with the black-legged tick. And then they carry their own suite of pathogens that manifest as different illnesses as well. They carry bourbon virus, ehrlichiosis, Heartland virus, southern tick-associated rash illness, different kinds of rickettsia, tularemia, and then probably the scariest of all of them is the red meat allergy, or alpha-gal syndrome. Just a quick note on that, this is popping up, becoming more and more prevalent. There's a small percentage of Lone Star ticks that carry this allergy, essentially, that they can transmit to human population, which basically makes the individual allergic to all mammalian meat. So you basically have this food poisoning anaphylactic shock response every time you eat red meat. So I know a lot of hunters out there who are terrified that they're going to run into this tick and subsequently get the red meat allergy and have to become pescatarians. So that's why, one of the reasons why it's such an important tick to look at, and it's just kind of coming up here right now. The other side of it too is it's got a slightly different behavioral strategy compared to a lot of the ticks we have in the northeastern United States. So the black-legged tick, as well as dog tick and so on and so forth, they're what we call the passive quest, which means they basically outstretch their front arms while they're hanging onto a blade of grass or a shrub, and they wait for something to pass by, and then they just kind of hook on, and then they'll go around the body until they find a place to attach to the skin. Lone Stars are much more aggressive. What they do is they pick up on CO2 emissions. So anytime you exhale, you're exhaling carbon dioxide. They pick up on that. They realize that there's a host within the vicinity, and then they kind of chase you down until they can get on you. And they're pretty fast and terrifying, and they're quite large. So I can tell you firsthand, it's not fun to encounter them, especially when they're out questing. Additionally, you can pick up a lot of larvae just from brushing up a vegetative patch where eggs were laid and the larvae had recently hatched. You can potentially pick up several hundred just in one swoop. And they're so small and quick that they can quickly attach, and they make all these little red bite marks on your skin, which can sometimes be misdiagnosed as just a skin rash, but it's actually a bunch of tick bites. We had one incident with Mr. Michael Short, who we were out in the field and he brushed up against a tall blade of grass that had probably a pocket of a couple hundred. And we quickly realized that they were all over him, and that was terrifying. You can ask him yourself. Nobody wants to encounter these. So it's definitely worth doing some research on them to figure out what their survival strategy is for up here. So now that we know our host species that we selected, I'm sorry, not our host species, our vector species that we selected, we decided to not only conduct this in Connecticut to see how the two species survive based on variable winter weather conditions, but we also wanted to have a Maine counterpart. We just wanted to see what the survival rate of these species would be in two slightly different environments. So Maine obviously having stereotypically more harsh winter or harsher winter conditions compared to Connecticut. Both were coastal regions though. So we conducted this study in these two locations over the course of 4 years. The first 3 years we just did Ixodes, or we had Ixodes scapularis, and then starting the second year to the fourth year we included the Lone Star tick as well. And so I won't go into too much detail about the experimental design of the project, but I just wanted to include just a couple of notes about the setup. So not only did we want to look at just the overview of winter weather conditions and their impacts on survival, but we also wanted to look at how insulative barriers played a role. So we included combination treatments for each of these pots that we put into the ground containing the ticks, with either a presence or absence of leaf litter or snow. So anytime it snowed and there was a pot that needed snow removal, we went and shoveled it away. And so this is an image of our site. So you can see the pot in the ground. So this is a pot put in, there's dirt and a little room left for a couple vials full of ticks. And then this is a no leaf litter plot. You can see they're kind of brushed away. And then over here, this is a snow removal area. So anytime it snowed, we'd go out and shovel the snow off of it so that they didn't have that extra insulative barrier. And then as you can see here, this is our Hamden site, and then this is our Cape Elizabeth, Maine site. So just enough that we had some variability in our winter weather conditions. So then if we're looking at the results from our black-legged tick samples, what we found was there wasn't really a difference between our locations, which was interesting in and of itself. They had pretty comparable survival between the two. However, there was a difference between treatment types. So what we found was the plots that had both layers of insulation intact for the entire season had the greatest level of survival, and those that had the layers removed did not. But what was interesting from that as well was the sites that had the leaf litter unmanipulated, so we left the leaf litter on top, those had the greatest survival out of all of them. And the ones that had snow removal were, they varied each year. And we believe that was primarily due to the fact that snow was, there was a couple years where we barely had any snow. And then the couple times it did snow, it didn't last long enough to provide a sustained insulative barrier. So that was interesting in and of itself. And then furthermore, we were able to have a regression analysis to determine what significant predictors there were for the survival of these tick species in both of these locations. And we found 1 year, because there's variability between the different winters each year. And then also minimum temperature and mean temperature played a significant role. And so if you look at these graphs of the minimum temperatures in year 1, and I have ones for year 2 and year 3 as well, you'll see this blue line right here is our ambient temperature. So we put HOVO data loggers into each of the pots, and then as well as ones externally out of the pot, so that we can look at humidity and temperature variations around the ticks. And so if you look at this, when they're all together in these warmer temperature, so this is probably like October, November, early December, there's not much difference between them. But once the temperature starts to drop and we see this ambient temperature really dip, this is when all the temperatures within pots based on insulated barriers really start to fracture. And these ones where both layers are removed drop pretty close to ambient temperature. And so we see that throughout all 3 years. So once again, higher temperatures, pretty much the same, lower temperatures, they start to fracture out. And then, so this is what we believe to be the driving force behind the survival of our black-legged tick populations. Is if we have that leaf litter layer, it definitely provides a consistent barrier that protects them from winter weather conditions and allows them to survive longer, which once again connects to our wooded landscape and the fact that most of Connecticut is covered in woodlands, so we're going to have a lot of leaf litter, and so if that's protecting all of our ticks all winter long, we're going to see a lot of them come through. And then when we look at the results from our Lone Star tick analysis, so this is where it varied a little bit between our 2 different species. So we did see significant difference in survival between our Connecticut Lone Star samples and our Maine Lone Star samples. So in Connecticut, I mean, this was pretty significant for both males and females. We had fairly high numbers for all 3 years. Let's see, we got 83 in this year as a high, 73, 78. Those are big numbers for these ticks to be surviving in a range that they historically had not inhabited. And then for Maine had much lower survival values, which means that they weren't able to survive the cold winters as well as they were here on coastal Connecticut. But I think it's still important to note that these are pretty high survival rates still. For a tick that's main range is southeastern United States to then be surviving in 73rd percentile in Maine, that's pretty significant. Even the lowest one, all you need is a couple ticks for this population to really take off. And so then when we look at them between the 2 different states, you can see why the survival dipped in Maine versus Connecticut. So if we're looking at the temperature above 0 in Connecticut, every treatment type had above 0, and we had these high survival rates. But then when you're looking at Maine and there's sub-zero temperatures for all the treatment types, you can understand why they dropped to such low values compared to our Connecticut values. So there's definitely a correlation here. So what does this all mean? So I know I covered one study really quickly. That whole study could probably have its own presentation, but the takeaways for the two different species that we're looking at is for our black-legged tick, or Ixodes scapularis, overall they had really, really high survival rate, which is what we'd expect for a northeastern tick. However, things like leaf litter play a significant role, and then looking at minimum temperatures also plays a pretty significant role. So that minimum temperature variable can be used as a predictor for fluctuations in populations within year. And then when we look at Amblyomma americanum, or the Lone Star tick, you can see that there was a pretty significant difference between our two sites, and that was due to the differences in temperature, or average minimum temperature. So those sub-zero temperatures being consistent in Maine definitely kept those survival numbers down. However, a lot of them still survives. And then something to include as well is the survival between the different treatment types was a little bit more variable for Lone Star tick, but still, once again, a fair amount of them, more than we expected, survived. And so I think that's the takeaway, is overall there was a surprisingly high survival rate for both species in both states. And that minimum temperature is really what's driving the survival of both species. So if that temperature continues to rise, the chances are the survival rates will rise as well. And not just in Connecticut, but throughout the Northeast, where we're typically characterized by 4 seasons, and one of which is a harsh winter. So when we look at that minimum temperature factor, this is a diagram I took from NOAA, and I think it's also in the Washington Post as well. But if you look at this temperature change diagram from 1895 to 2018, you can see all these locations here are where we have high density established Lone Star tick populations. And they're all in this red category, which is where there's been a 2.5 degrees Celsius temperature change. So this is pretty significant relationship that we're seeing here. And we observed it in our study, and it's only further solidified in this type of diagram. And so specifically I wanted to bring up this one population of Lone Star ticks that caught all of our attention a couple years ago, where it was noted that there was a population of deer in Norwalk, Connecticut. So once again, I know my line's overlapping here a little bit. This is a very, very red part of Connecticut. So 2.5 degrees Celsius increase in average temperature. In that same area is where a huge, huge population of Lone Star ticks has established, to the point where they're overwhelming their host species. So this is a deer, a white-tailed deer that was overwhelmed and succumb to an infestation of Lone Star ticks, which is not even typical within their normal range, because a parasite doesn't necessarily want to kill their host. They want to keep it alive for as long as possible. So there's definitely this relationship going on between this not introduced species, but a species that's expanding its range northward in response to warmer climates, and it's taking over areas where it would not normally inhabit. So then once again, if we look at that map, in the hot zones, I'll call it the hot spots, it almost perfectly overlays with where we have seen established and reported populations of Lone Star ticks. So this is a map by Dr. Godard-Malai, where you can see all this blue is where they've been reported, but this red is established populations of Lone Star tick. And it's pretty remarkable how closely they overlap one another. I don't think that's a coincidence. And so because of the study and looking at the product of it, which was determining significant predictors and things like the correlation between minimum temperature and the survival of a native species as well as a newly invaded species, other regional efforts are being made to look at this on a larger scale and look at larger implications of climate change and temperatures warming and milder winters on other tick species. So the Ag Station, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, has several departments that are part of the Northeast Regional Center of Excellence in Vector-borne Diseases. And this is a group composed of several states throughout the Northeast that looks at ticks and mosquitoes and management strategies and research and all that good stuff. And so we decided as a group that we wanted to expand this project to incorporate other states, other counties, and also other ticks. And so the one that we selected, or I shouldn't say we selected, but was selected to look further into is the Asian longhorn tick, or Haemaphysalis longicornis. So this is a relatively new tick. It was found originally in New Jersey, but it's normally from the Western Hemisphere. It's been introduced to Australia and New Zealand and is quite profound there. But I believe it was in 2017 was the first case of it found in New Jersey in the United States. And it was found on a sheep farm. And I always love this story, but I'll keep it short. Basically, the New Jersey Department of Agriculture got a call about a farm with sheep that had several sheep that were completely infested with a tick species. They couldn't identify the tick species. It had killed, I believe, a couple of the sheep. The other ones were extremely lethargic, not doing well. And so a representative went out and they said, that sheep over there, Hannah, she has a lot on her. And so the representative went to go check the sheep. The sheep decided that he didn't want to be checked, or she didn't want to be checked. He chased down the sheep, tackled the sheep, and I think knocked it out a little bit. And then the poor farmer was like, you know, usually when I need to go check her out, I just give her a bowl of grain and she comes right back to me. But either way, they got their sample, you know, scientists doing some hard-hitting work, pun intended. So they got the sample and they realized that it was the Asian longhorn tick. So not great that this is on the landscape, because it primarily parasitizes livestock and other comparable wildlife, but it will go for companion animals, different bird species, and occasionally it will feed on a human. They primarily do not like to feed on humans, but they will. And so this diagram just kind of shows from one sample all the different species that it was able to collect a blood meal from. So while they do prioritize livestock and comparable species, they'll run the full gamut of hosts. And so, like I said, they're historically only found in the Western Hemisphere, but they're slowly making their way over to our side of the globe, specifically our coast. And they're quite nondescript, so sometimes they can go unreported because they're not properly identified. And so this is a nymph, and this is an adult female, and you'll rarely find the adult males. I don't even think I have a photo of them. But they're pretty significant because of the fact that they're parthenogenic. So what that means is the females can lay eggs and reproduce without mating. So you don't need a male and a female even to establish a population. You basically just need one female tick and you're good to go. Additionally, it is a 3-host tick, like a lot of the ticks we have in Connecticut and much of the Northeast. So once again, if there's any pathogen presence, that's 3 individuals that it could pass those pathogens to. They can be found in a variety of habitats such as short grass, long grass, woods, full sun, partial sun, shade, and they prefer it to be hot and humid. So essentially all the same habitat qualifications that a black-legged tick needs, so it can do quite well in Connecticut as well as much of the Northeast. And then likewise, the seasonality of the larval peak season is the same as black-legged tick in late summer, early fall. And then, like I said, although they prefer livestock, they will feed on deer, which we have plenty of. And then they're also not very aggressive and they don't readily feed on human, but there was one case in Connecticut that was confirmed. And so far we haven't seen much human cases besides that. And then, like I said, they're continuing to spread. They've been reported in 12 different states, 82 different counties, and they're continuing to expand in both density and distribution. You can notice a trend here. And then this is a projection of how far they can spread on the Eastern Hemisphere if left unchecked. So the reason that this kind of ties into our topic of climate change and specifically winters is because their seasonality here, as seen in New Jersey, compared to their previous natural habitat, I should say, is they also have to undergo an overwintering period. So even though our winters are milder, they're still winters, which means that they have to kind of tuck themselves away under the leaf litter, just like all of our other species. But if we don't have these harsh cold snaps or extended periods of low minimum temperatures, like we were seeing up in Maine or even farther north, the likelihood of them surviving is much, much greater. And so when the combination of these mild winters and their parthenogenic traits, they can quite easily take over a good portion of our northeastern habitat. So they're definitely species that we need to pay attention to, and it's good to have on your radar. Okay, so we have talked about our native species and its ties to milder winters. We've talked about a southeastern species that it's expanding its range in response to milder temperatures and climate conditions. We've talked about an exotic introduced species that has kind of popped up on our landscape and has potential to really take over. But we also have another tick that we don't talk about very often in Connecticut, but is causing a lot of havoc a little farther north than us. And this is the winter tick, or Dermacentor albipictus. And so right here, you have a picture of the adult female and the adult male, and then this is a collection of them. I believe that's an ear of a moose. And so these guys are pretty important and definitely worth paying attention to in the coming seasons. So we've had a couple pop up here or been submitted to the station on occasion, but the winter tick is their primary host. Pretty much the only host that they consistently feed on is the moose. And so because we only have a handful of moose here in Connecticut, it makes sense that we only have a handful of winter ticks that occasionally pop up, which is good. But in more northern areas like New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, they have greater populations of moose and thus greater populations of winter tick. And the winter tick lives out its entire life cycle on one host. So it takes a moose just brushing up against a patch of vegetation with a recently hatched nest, and they can pick up hundreds of these ticks, and then they will feed on them through each subsequent life stage. So this is a lot. They say about, on average, a moose will carry like over 100,000 winter ticks at a given time. And these ticks are much larger than a lot of our ticks that we see around here. So they can obtain a fairly large blood meal just from one tick. So you can see these, they're kind of gross. But to have 100,000 of these on a single individual, even a moose, which is a very large animal, is disconcerting. And so furthermore, they're only growing in numbers in response to this change in climate and milder winters. So our milder winters in Connecticut might be different than what we're seeing in Maine, but Maine is still seeing this shift in climate conditions and minimum temperatures as well as snowfall. And what's happening is that typically when you see a winter tick, if it falls off in a normal harsh winter with adequate snowfall, it'll die instantly. So this reduces the numbers of females that are able to go find a patch of vegetation and lay their eggs and keep going with the cycle. So that's how it normally should work. But with these mild winters and minimal snowfall, more and more of these females that are dropping out to lay their eggs are surviving once they hit the ground, and so are their eggs, and then they'll transition to the larval stage. And so with that in mind, they have more opportunities or more cases that are able to encounter these moose and attach to them and feed off of them. And so as a result, these moose are being inundated with winter ticks, and they're actually decimating the moose population. It's crazy to think that this tiny little tick could take out a moose, but it can, and it has. So as a result, with these warmer climates and increased number of winter ticks, we're finding that they're causing issues based on insulation through hair loss and fat content of moose. So the moose will get irritated skin by all the ticks that are attached to them, and they'll find a hard surface and they'll rub trying to get them off because they can't groom very well, and they'll essentially rub all the hair off of them, which is terrible. So that's the loss of one insulative barrier. The second insulative barrier is their fat content. So all this irritation and distraction trying to groom these ticks off of them distracts them from consuming enough calories to make it through the winter. So they end up being these much skinnier, hairless versions of themselves. And when they get to this most severe state, they're called a ghost moose, which I think I have another picture. So they're skinny and they start to turn this opaque color because they've rubbed most of their fur off. And so we're finding more and more of these ghost moose individuals on the landscape that are being depleted of these necessary insulative layers to get them through the winter. And so it's becoming a huge issue. And not only is it driving moose populations down so low, but then the few that are remaining become even more inundated with ticks because there's fewer hosts on the landscape. So it's decimating the population. They've even had to cancel a couple seasons of moose hunting in certain areas because the populations are so depleted, and it's quite sad. And they say one of the leading causes for the decline in the population is because these ticks, they don't know the difference between calves and adults, and calves are obviously a much smaller bodied animal. And so they will feed on the calves, and they're essentially killing there's a 70% mortality rate of calves in these moose populations. And so they're wiping out the whole population by not allowing them to regenerate. And with a moose, they'll have 1 or maybe 2 calves in that cycle. And to eliminate 70% of those is really having a huge impact on this population. So it's gaining more and more interest from the entomology side as well as wildlife conservation side as to how to sustain this population of moose while also depleting the winter tick. And so there's been a couple controversial approaches to this, which is both of them kind of leading to the same point where moose populations have to reach minimal levels, very few individuals, in order to drive down the winter tick populations by essentially eliminating the hosts. But either way, it's not looking very great for the moose. And so much of it is tied to this change in temperature and really allowing these milder winters to let winter ticks survive in greater numbers, and they're just running these moose populations into the ground. So like we're looking back at this diagram again. If you're looking at these areas, which is pretty much here and up where we find the majority of our moose population in the Northeast, their temperature change is anywhere from 1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius as well. So there's this direct tie between all these different tick species and this increase in temperature and how it's allowing them to expand or increase in density, expand their distribution, and also allow for a greater diversity of these tick species, which can only lend to a greater diversity of tick-borne illnesses. And so that's kind of the drive home message of my talk today, is that with these milder winters, this direct link to a changing climate, we're seeing increases in these categories across the board. So when we're looking at the native endemic species, so looking at the winter tick and the black-legged tick, they're not only increasing density within their own habitat, but also on their hosts. If you have a moose that's tripling its tick load and it's draining them and causing them to not survive the winter, that's huge. I mean, they're a huge keystone species and habitat modifiers. And then they're also expanding their range, as we saw in those earlier images, where they're no longer just concentrated in these like warmer coastal regions. They're expanding inland and upland. And then we're looking at species that are native to other regions that historically haven't been found in our landscape that are making their way up, and they're finding that the habitat's hospitable, the hosts work for them, and then they can survive our harsh winters, which typically were the limiting factor in previous years. And then finally, we have these exotic species coming into our landscape that shouldn't be able to survive in our northeastern ecosystem because of those 4 seasons that we talked about. And because they're so much warmer and so much milder, they're able to survive. So it's basically eliminating a lot of the natural barriers that should prevent these species from surviving in these areas. And so the major takeaways from this are that native ticks will remain to be the primary disease risk, and their range is expanding. Lyme disease is still going to be at the forefront, and so are black-legged ticks. Obviously, you saw from those numbers, they continue to increase over time. But climate change specifically is such an important factor when we look at the range expansion and the geographic distribution of all these ticks and the ticks that we don't know about yet or that haven't made it to our landscape yet. And then the introduction of both native as well as exotic and invasive ticks is a threat to humans, pets, livestock, and wildlife. This is multidimensional. It's not like it only attacks one species or pathogens only affect one. It's going to affect all of us, both directly and indirectly. And then the big take home is new ticks and tick-borne diseases will be an increasing concern due to geographic expansion of native species and the ever-present potential introduction of invasive and/or exotic and new pathogens. So like I said, this is an increasing concern for all of us, and not just us in Connecticut. Like I said, these ticks don't know state or country borders. They're going to continue to expand. So we need to work on this regional effort to kind of promote knowledge, make these connections, and hopefully use them as part of better management strategies. And so that leads me to my final point, which hopefully is a little bit of an uplift for all of this. So I don't want this to all seem like doom and gloom because, you know, nobody likes ticks. I think we could all do without them. But the relationship between climate change or overwintering variables and even just their summer questing variables as well, it's such an important relationship for us to quantify as researchers. Knowing this relationship can really help better our management strategies. So right now at the station, I'm just talking about one of our studies, but we do a lot of studies on management strategies and combinations of management strategies to be applied in our woodland atmospheres, in our residential areas, small scale, large scale, you name it. And we have a bunch of different strategies that work really, really well. However, fully understanding this relationship between all these different tick species and these different geographic ranges and their connection to overwintering factors such as minimum and mean temperature or even insulated barriers can only help strengthen those management strategies. So by adding this to our toolkit, we can better predict annual fluctuations or fluctuations over time. So for instance, the goal of learning this information is that maybe we can use it as a predictive analytic tool so that one year, if we have a really, really harsh winter again, and we can predict based on the minimum temperatures we're seeing in our region that tick populations are going to take a nosedive in the following spring, then we can have a really aggressive management strategy that can attack that minimal population and hopefully really drive it into the ground. So like I said, the purpose of this presentation is not necessarily to talk about all these ticks that are popping up and how they're hurting our public health or wildlife health or forest health, rather highlighting the relationship between climate change, specifically looking at overwintering factors and how the combination of those against our tick and tick-borne diseases can help us better manage these species in the future. And overall, the goal being that we can reduce ticks on the landscape and subsequently tick-borne illnesses. And so hopefully we can keep on going with our research and keep on studying things like the overwintering factors on Longicornis, like I was talking about, and the implications on our management strategies, and we can help us all out and hopefully eliminate some of these diseases that we're seeing. And with that being said, I just wanted to take a second to thank all the amazing people who have helped me for the past 8 years and my team. All these people are fantastic and work so hard and do such an amazing job and are innovative and awesome. And then I just also want to say thank you guys for tuning in, and hopefully everyone's still awake. I think I can take questions now. I think I still have some time, but if not, my email, my phone number are listed here, so please feel free to reach out at any point. Let's see. Bear with me one sec while I look at questions. Oh, so one of the questions was wondering how long does it take for the Lone Star tick to transmit disease? So it depends on what disease it is. This goes for all ticks in general. I feel like, and I can't speak to all the diseases, but for most diseases, for most ticks, it's 24 to 48 hours is a typical window, but it changes based on the pathogen and the tick species. I know that's not a clear answer, but it's variable. It depends on which one, because they're carried in different parts of their body, so depending on where it is and the transmission time it takes. Next question was, how does temperature correlate with host survival? Well, that's a good question. So that definitely plays a role as well, because and there's once again multiple factors that can play into this, but the one that pops into my head immediately is once again, if you have an extremely cold, harsh winter, your host survival would most likely drop as well, because they might not be able to survive the winter, so that can drop, and then you'd see the repercussions of that the following year, because if there's not enough hosts on the landscape when they're out questing post-winter, they won't be able to obtain a blood meal and transition to the next life stage. So that's probably the most direct relationship between temperature and host survival, and then tick and tick-borne diseases. Oh, great question, Gail Ridge. So the next question I saw was, can DART treatment of moose with ivermectin provide a protection against the winter tick? This is a fantastic question. So ivermectin is very effective on a whole suite of different tick species. So the direct question is, yes, ivermectin could absolutely reduce winter ticks. However, there's been a lot of issues with administering this kind of treatment, or really any kind of treatment to moose, because they're so elusive. And they're difficult to kind of pin down. So in Connecticut or anywhere where there's large abundance of deer typically travel in herds. So you can set up a 4-poster station, which is essentially a bait site with permethrin-coated rollers, and they feed off of it, and it treats their neck and ears and everything where all the ticks are on them. And you'll get multiple deer visiting this, so you'll have a greater subset of the deer population that are treated, whereas with moose, they're hard enough to track down just one at a time. So in order to effectively treat a whole population with ivermectin is really, really difficult. And I know they've tried a couple different strategies for doing this, and I think they have, none of them have been as effective as they need to be. So great question. Okay, I think I answered all the questions. Alrighty, I think that's it. Thank you all for chiming in and asking great questions, and let me know if anything else pops up. Thank you all for coming.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on, Megan. There's another question I just saw from Cindy. Are you updating the tick management guide that you picture in your presentation?
The tick management handbook?
I think that's what she mean. Tick management guide.
I think if she's talking about the tick management handbook, which was one of the
okay.
One of the last slides. Yes, so, and that's a question that could go directly to Dr. Stafford. He has been updating, over the past couple of years, he's been working on updating it. And of course, every time you update it, there's a new species on the landscape or some new treatment. So hopefully that'll be out in the next couple of years here before he leaves us and retires. But yes, there will be an updated version of that. However, the version that's still available is it's a lot of the management strategies for the ticks that we've seen that book are very much still applicable. So I believe that's on the station webpage. You can find that.
All right. And another question from the question is enlisting hunter to administer the medicine via that would be a good. She's just commenting.
Oh yeah, yep, I see that. Enlisting hunters to administer the medicine via darts would be a good idea. Absolutely, but I think they're going to run into a lot of the same issues that I mentioned prior, which is just tracking them down and inoculating an effective amount of the population to bring numbers down. Treating one moose with ivermectin is not going to bring down the numbers enough, and because the populations are either declining even more and more, it's even harder to come across them and treat them effectively. So yes, I mean, any kind of recruitment to treat them would be great. It's just how effective it would actually be.
All right. Look like we have no further question. Thank you so much, Megan, for the wonderful presentation. We learned how climate change have been affecting the tick management. That is wonderful. Thank you, everyone, and give her a big virtual applause. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.